ES Audio.
Every successful entrepreneur will give you the same advice when it comes to setting up a business. Find a problem that needs solving. Well, that's exactly what entrepreneur and now CEO Richard Mabey did.
I've never yet met a person who's told me that they didn't find working with contracts painful.
Back in 2016, he co-founded Juro, an online platform designed to make creating, altering and signing contracts a lot quicker. But Richard followed an unusual path to get there, leaving his job as a lawyer to pursue his mission to improve the way we deal with contracts.
Lawyers tend to be very detail-minded, risk-averse. They're not naturally sort of lending themselves to being entrepreneurs.
This is a story all about identifying a problem and learning how to create and sell the solution.
Law firms bill by the hour. So if you bill by the hour and someone says, do you want to save time? You go, kind of yes, kind of no.
Last year, Juro processed 500,000 contracts, but Richard's hoping it will eventually become the default platform for contracts across the world.
Well, the funny thing about contracts is really everyone uses them. So we sometimes think contracts are for lawyers, and I come from a legal background, but actually, we all interact with contracts, whether that's signing our employment contract when we get a new job, maybe a consulting agreement if you're a freelancer, if you're leasing a house, for example, or a flat. We interact with these documents, but generally the process of agreeing those documents is a very manual, archaic process. It tends to involve assembling Microsoft Word documents, saving them as PDFs. We now have e-signature, which can help a little bit, but most of that process is pretty manual. And to most people who aren't deeply involved in the law, it's a very confusing process as well. So when we started Juro, really what we wanted to do is build a very streamlined tool and service that would allow people to create, execute and manage legal contracts very easily in the browser, online and in one place.
To get to this point where you're running Juro as it is at the moment, I imagine you've gone through a bit of a journey. You sort of mentioned you've got a background in legal as it is. Can you sort of talk us through your story, I suppose, how you got to where Juro is now?
So my story is quite an unusual one in that I came from a legal background, as you say, which is not a kind of traditional path for an entrepreneur. So lawyers tend to be very detail-minded, risk-averse. They're not naturally sort of lending themselves to being entrepreneurs. But the experience that I had as a lawyer, especially being frustrated by manual process, taught me that there definitely was a problem to be solved in this area. And I think having had that personal experience and experienced the pain gives you a lot of confidence that you can get out and build a solution. But really that was the early part of my career, and that's almost 10 years ago since I stopped being a lawyer. Since then, I went to business school. So I went to INSEAD just outside Paris, which is where I met my co-founder, Pavel, and we run Juro together. And then I got a role in product for a company called LegalZoom, which was a US legal tech company that was emerging. And I didn't really know what product was, but I got this gig. And I learned what it would take to actually build amazing software that people love in a legal context. So a lot of kind of what I've done has been really kind of specialized in this area. But of course, the more you get into running a company, the more you realize that, yes, the specialist subject matters a little bit, but all of the other things of how you build a great organization and a great team, how you raise funding, are all the same challenges that everyone else faces. So I've really had to learn those on the job through making mistakes, through trial and error, and through figuring things out.
You sort of mentioned the funding element there. And I understand you've been quite successful with several rounds of funding so far. What do you think it is about Juro that's sort of excited investors?
So it's always a hard thing to answer. I think, sometimes you have to ask the investors themselves. But I think the journey we went on, we tended to look at really sort of three things. So team, traction and technology. Right. So team, do we have the right group of people that could execute on this opportunity? And I think Juro were lucky in that I came from a legal background. We had that kind of legal DNA in the team, which was certainly helpful when we sell our software to in-house legal teams. So understanding the customer, very important. Pavel came from a computer science background, a technology background. So we had this cross-functional team. And as we built it, we built in great designers and great commercial folks, a great people and talent team. And I think that was exciting to the investors, which is, it's hard to build a specialized cross-functional team. On the technology, I think our vision has always been that we should become the default way to agree terms online, which is a big vision. And that's something that, I think appealed to our venture capital investors like Point Nine Capital and Seed Camp and Union Square Ventures and 8 Rows. And then traction. So I think, we found that there was a real pressing need for what we're building. And that meant that our early customers, many of whom are still customers, 5 years later, were pulling the product. And even though the product wasn't fully built, they were using it and were paying for it. So we're able to point to traction and fast growth as well. And I think, fundraising is, every entrepreneur I speak to says what a nightmare it is. And certainly for us, we faced tons of rejection along the way. I think you just have to kind of keep on in that core belief that there is a big problem to solve here. You can solve it, and you just need to find the right partners to do that with.
Some of the companies that have been your customers, companies like Deliveroo, Kazoo and Curve, all quite young, quite new businesses. Do you think some of the more sort of long-standing, older companies need more convincing before becoming one of your customers?
It's a really good question. So you're absolutely right. The sort of early customers of Juro were all these kind of venture-backed technology businesses. And the thing they all had in common was they're processing loads and loads of contracts. So you mentioned Deliveroo and Kazoo. These are very, very fast-growing companies. Thousands of contracts processed per year. And Juro is the platform through which they can do that. I think the other aspect of that is obviously very forward-looking legal teams in those companies. So people really willing to do things in a new way. And if you think as a lawyer, you might spend 3 hours a day in email and Microsoft Word. You're suddenly transitioning completely to Juro. It's quite a radical shift. So we definitely found our community there. We now have a community of 700 in-house lawyers. It's the largest community of its type in Europe. And a lot of them are that profile of kind of early adopter. I think as we've grown and our revenue has grown over time, we've been able to find more and more customers who are more perhaps traditional backgrounds. So these might be corporates who are maybe a little bit larger, better established. And the funny thing is, in those companies, even though we think of them as very kind of corporate and established, there are still great champions there. So we work with some automotive companies and financial services companies, some of which are more than 100 years old. Still, you find those champions who are sitting at their desk, incredibly frustrated by the manual process they're going through and willing to work with a challenger vendor like us. And I think those are the real heroes, right? Because there's such a headwind when you're trying to force that change in an organization of that type. And it takes time. It may take 6 months to actually be able to buy the software. But when you get there, you can create this amazing change.
In terms of convincing, I suppose, businesses to take on Juro, what are some of the challenges, or I suppose more interesting challenges that you faced? Because as you said, you're trying to sell something that will take a while to implement, that is completely new to a lot of people in a lot of industries, really.
Yeah, so the challenges to get Juro adopted are threefold, really. So the first is this a product that people want? And I think this is the big mistake that a lot of startups make, is that you build a product that you think people want, but they don't actually want. So we spend a huge amount of time speaking to users, doing user research, trying to get a really granular handle of like, what exactly do they need to solve and how can Juro do that? And it's become an obsession. I mean, a real design obsession within the company to build something that's just amazing. And that's part of the battle. If you can do that, then there's going to be a certain amount of pull. And many of our customers are coming to us from recommendations from other customers, people who leave a company, go to a new company. If you give them a great service, that will bring growth. I think the second is navigating, business to business sales. It's very different from if you sell, bananas online. There's one person who buys the banana, one person who eats the banana, right? Whereas if you're selling this software that we sell, the number of people involved in contracts is quite high. So you've got people in legal, people in sales, people in HR and finance, executives. So you've got to navigate those processes. And we built this fantastic commercial team who have really kind of worked hard to understand that pattern. And then I think the third thing is ensuring that the people who are building and selling Juro are the right people and people who we believe, live our values. And so outside of the whole, building a thing and selling it, you've got to build a team that actually customers want to work with. And I found that to be a real advantage where we have a tricky deployment or a tricky customer, very entrenched in their ways. Just having a superstar in our implementation team who really is empathetic, is listening to the customer, etc., that makes a vast difference. So yeah, part of it's software, part of it's people as well.
I watched a couple of videos of how Juro works just to get my head around it myself. And I was sold quite quickly on the idea. And it just made me think, Why has it taken so long for this kind of thing to come about?
It's a really good question. I think I've never yet met a person who's told me that they didn't find working with contracts painful. That includes lawyers, that includes journalists. Everyone finds it a bad process. So it's a really good question. It's like, well, why hasn't it been solved? And it's something we looked at in the early days. We sort of, as co-founders, looked at each other and we're like, well, I think we know the solution here, but what are we missing? I mean, this has been a problem for a while. Like Microsoft Word has been out since 1983, right? So we're talking sort of 40 years of this Word email tennis process. And there are a few reasons for it. I mean, one is, we don't work with law firms, right? We work with in-house legal teams, but law firms bill by the hour. So if you bill by the hour and someone says, do you want to save time? You go, kind of yes, kind of no, right? Because if we're streamlining our work, maybe we're going to bill less. That's a structural problem, I think, with law firms. And many of the better law firms are moving away from that, billable hour model. But that has been a bit of a problem. I think lawyers are risk averse, and rightly. You want your lawyer to be risk averse, right? You don't want them to be taking gambles. So that can sometimes make change a little bit harder.
Let's take a break now. In part 2, Richard talks security online, job losses, and artificial intelligence.
Some of the things that really excite us is how you can use AI and machine learning to start to help lawyers do some of the more complex jobs.
I was going to ask, you talk a lot about email tennis, which is something that everyone deals with. Are you sort of aiming for Juro to become the norm? Everyone uses it for contracts.
So our vision is to become the default way to agree contracts online. So the way today is Word, email, PDF, maybe an e-signature platform, if you're lucky. We used to print stuff and scan it. Fortunately, no one has a scanner now, and we're saving a lot of pieces of paper. And then you've got to store it. Right, so you've got to store it in Google Drive or wherever it is. So, we found this thing that sort of currently takes like 5 tools to go and agree one contract. We think by having an all-in-one platform, you just go to Juro and you could agree it. And I think in the future, we want to get to a state where people say, look, do we want to actually waste a lot of time here on manual process? Or maybe if each of us just uses Juro as a collaborative platform for this, we're both going to save a lot of time.
In terms of the tech, I'm personally quite interested in tech and things like AI and machine learning and that kind of thing. Is this a lot more simple than those kinds of things, or does it use elements of either at all?
We've looked at elements of AI, so machine learning, natural language processing, quite a bit in contracts. I think, most of our focus over the last year has been actually in building out the core platform. So ensuring that we have a great editor for contracts, ensuring that we integrate with other tools really easily, ensuring the user experience is particularly refined and easy. So getting a lot of those basics right. I think looking ahead, some of the things that really excite us is how you can use AI and machine learning to start to help lawyers do some of the more complex jobs. Right, so there's the basic jobs, which are you've got to populate a template and you've got to, exchange a document, you've got to compare versions, you've got to sign it. You can do all that. Over time, the exciting thing is you can start to predict actually what people should negotiate based on past behavior. So if, for example, the Evening Standard is signing 50 employment contracts a year of whatever it is, and there's some negotiation in those terms, if you use Juro, you actually know what the negotiation points are. That will help you then to inform, what drafting you need. Very hard, meaty challenge, but an exciting one. We really see that as a partnership between lawyer and the machine, right? So lawyers are augmented by having this really smart technology to help them out. And as a lawyer, I would have loved that, right? That would have really helped me. What we don't think we can replace is that human judgment, right? So the thing that you just know when you have a good lawyer and you know when you have a bad lawyer with is, what does all that experience and logic and thinking do? And we're just a really long way away from that, I think, in AI. But there's some really simple things that we can absolutely help with.
That sort of brings me on to my next question, where I was going to ask, people will hear about this kind of tech saving time, doing jobs people don't want to do, and think job losses. Is that sort of the aim? Are you sort of aiming to save companies money by using this instead of people in any way?
We thought about this quite a lot in the early days, which is why we're automating all this process. The interesting reaction from the users is actually tends not to be one of fear of job loss. It tends to be one of delight, which is essentially the technology is going to be doing the absolute worst part of my job that I don't want to do. And that means I can reallocate my time into higher value tasks. So we actually see it more as a win-win there. And, I was surprised by that as well. And I think, the more we learn about, people, especially in kind of desk jobs, in London or wherever it may be, it's a lot of people just frustrated by doing a hell of a lot of manual, low value tasks, and that getting in the way of, like, one, them being able to do the job they really want to do, two, being able to learn new things, and three, being able to go home on time, or being able to switch off at their desk and, walk to the kitchen if they're working from home and have a normal life. So actually, we think this is a big positive.
One of the other things that sort of came to mind when I was thinking about this tech was the security around these contracts. Obviously, when you're sending things online for some person to sign, are there vulnerabilities that could mean bad actors exploiting this technology?
We spend a lot of time on information security, and we have whole teams that work on these things, because no software is ever 100% safe, right? And that includes, by the way, exchanging Microsoft Word files on email, right? So if you email that to the wrong person, it's lost forever, right? I think Juro actually improves on the status quo. And we do that with features like, we have a contract locking feature. So if you share a contract with a URL and you no longer want it to be visible, you can just lock it. We have time limited URLs, right? So if you share a link, you can say, well, this is going to be available for 2 days. You can't do that with Google Docs. You can't do that with sharing a file over an email. So on the one hand, of course, we have this huge migration to the cloud. And, I think the cloud is forecast to grow to 500 billion or so this year. So there's massive growth happening here, and it's being adopted everywhere. And I think as long as the access controls are secure, the protocols followed are right, actually software can give you a more secure way of operating than what you had previously. But of course, it comes with risks, and it's something we invest in a lot in and take extremely seriously.
Richard, my final question for you. What would you say to young people, young entrepreneurs, hoping to reach the position of CEO of a company one day?
So I think that the biggest learning I've really had in my job, so I've been running Juro for 5-6 years, first time CEO, right? And in the early days, it's funny, you give yourself this title CEO, but there's only 2 people in the company. So it always seems funny. And now, we have 100 people in the company, and we're growing really, really fast. And so actually, you kind of grow into this role. I think that the number one thing I've learned really is all companies are people games, right? So no matter what you're doing, what you're selling, what the services are, I think one thing that has paid huge dividends for us as a company is just the common decency and the empathy of understanding fellow human beings. And that's not something you need a degree for, right? That's not something that you need to be very, academically clever at. You don't need to be highly experienced at. You need to be a good person. And I think if you start by being a good person, it can have a huge effect. And I think the thing that can give young entrepreneurs a lot of confidence, especially if you're not coming from this sort of amazing CV background and whatever else, is you've only really have 3 tasks. You've got to make sure you find a problem that's worth solving. You've got to be able to solve that problem. And then you've got to be able to build together a group of people who are going to execute on that in the long term. Now, none of those things require a degree, right? And I think the thing that you need to ask yourself as an entrepreneur is actually, do you love building groups of people? Do you love developing people? Do you love working with people? And are you the right kind of person for that? And if you are, you've gone at least 50% of the way. The rewarding thing is, in whatever you're doing, is if you build a company where people are excited to come to work every day, actually you've improved at least, in the case of Juro, 100 people's lives. If you build a great product as well, you're going to improve the world a little bit more. So always thinking from the very early days about people first is of paramount importance.
That was Richard Mabey, CEO of Juro. For all the latest business news, interviews and features, head to standard.co.uk/business or pick up the Evening Standard newspaper. How to be a CEO is back first thing Monday morning.